So we left off with Dr. Armstrong's troubled dreams of um, his troubled sleep, and then he is awoken from this dream and kind of startled by Mr. Rogers to let him know that Mrs. Rogers will not wake up. There's something odd or queer about um, her. And he goes and, true to his profession, he's got to perform his duty, he goes and he takes care of Mrs. Rogers, who has died in her sleep. And it we get this conversation between Mr. Rogers and Dr. Armstrong, kind of assessing her health and if she's gone to a doctor, if she's taken anything, and all this, that, and the other. And we find out that Mrs. Rogers doesn't sleep particularly well either. So it goes back to that idea about sleep and being this inability to do so is tied to having a lot on one's mind, particularly dealing with guilt. So after Mrs. Rogers has been pronounced dead, we have breakfast. And like I said earlier, they come together collectively as a group, and there is that kind of reestablishment of normalcy, this reestablishment of order, this reestablishment of this social hierarchy, and this reestablishment of kind of comfort and ease. And what I think is particularly interesting about this meal is that it really tells us a lot about our characters and about their mindsets and about kind of the cultural context. And the first thing that it really tells us is that it tells us a lot about social expectations and the performance of duty. And despite the death of his wife, Mr. Rogers' wife has just died. And I don't know about you, but if my husband had just passed away, I would not be right back at it to work. Right? It's whether or not he's responsible for her death or not, um, he has lost somebody important to him. And that is not taken into account by anybody, mainly because he's the servant. So it's and I guess in some ways it's when I was saying like this expectation of Rogers to do his job, and general Dr. Armstrong, naturally doing his duty, would see to her death as a doctor. That's not really surprising. But Rogers, the expectation for him to work, gives us insight in how he's viewed as a servant and that he is less important. We also get to know more about our characters through their interactions with each other. And we find out automatically that they are very suspicious. And not only are they suspicious of Roger, they are suspicious of each other. All of them believe the accusations from the indictments. Emily Brent, especially when it comes to the Rogerses. Emily Brent says that Mrs. Rogers died of a guilty conscience, and she says, look how she fell apart and fainted last night. That's the sign of a guilty mind. And really note her religious convictions as she's kind of going through this kind of spiel. She says that God punishes sinners. They also suspect that Rogers may have done away with his wife to keep her quiet. So essentially, she's seen as weak, and in order to keep this secret, he's got to kind of shut her up once and for all. And there are some real undertones here about how the men view women. And it all circles around they're saying all these things about Mr. and Mrs. Rogers, but we get the indication that these men think that women can't keep quiet, they can't keep a secret, and in a roundabout way, they can bring a man to his death. So, like, Mrs. Rogers has no loyalty to her husband. In order to kind of save her own skin, they say that she would have talked, and that's why Mr. Rogers has to do away with her. There's also kind of this mention very briefly, and I wanted to. I mean, it's easily overlooked. I think I overlooked it the first couple of times I've read this novel, but I think it's important to point out this kind of mention of women tied to insanity, because I think Bloor says, well, it could have been the moonshine, and not like the drink, but moonshine as in the moon, and that's association with insanity or lunacy. And basically, he says Mrs. Rogers may have killed herself because she's crazy. And I want you guys to keep that kind of mention of insanity in the back of your mind as we move through this novel. And the only person, and this is the other interesting thing that I think is worth noting from this breakfast scene, is the only real person who can't rationalize this suspicion that Mr. Rogers has killed his wife is General MacArthur. And he says a man wouldn't do that to to his wife. A man might murder another man, like he has done, but never to his wife. And you'll note that while everyone else is concerned about the motorboat getting to the island, General MacArthur is the only one who gives any sympathy to Rogers about his wife's death. He actually speaks to him saying, "I'm sorry that your wife has died." And he's really the only one who acknowledges that he has suffered this real loss. And my question to you is why? Why is General MacArthur the only one who does that? And um, this is just speculation on my part. You guys may have another view of this, but I think it goes back to how deeply devoted he was to his own wife and how much he loved Leslie. And to lose her, to have her die, was one of the major losses of his life, and it has affected him profoundly. And I think it also kind of ties back to General MacArthur kind of breaking these kind of social customs and these social expectations where he can kind of see Rogers as a person and not as a servant. Kind of goes back to this kind of epiphany that he's had in his room the night before, about um, this kind of new view of life, and that it's very short, it doesn't matter, and he's kind of made his peace and he's reconciled himself to his own demise. So take that for what you will. I also wanted to briefly mention, if I because I missed it in talking about other things, but you'll notice that they have this conversation about Mr. Rogers and whether or not he killed his wife behind his back. He's not in the room. So at the end of this kind of chapter, we get the sense that the other visitors, the characters, are growing increasingly concerned and suspicious, and they're all hanging on the hope that they'll be rescued. And then we get the resolved, calm voice of General MacArthur, that's the point. None of us is meant to leave the island. So at the beginning of chapter 7, we get this private conversation between Vera and Emily. And it's important to note the similarities and differences between these two women, because now that Mrs. Rogers is dead, Vera and Emily are our only two female characters on the island. And they are in some ways these foil characters, and foil characters are characters who are opposite in order to highlight the differences between the two. And uh, we know that Emily is old, Vera is young. Emily is very traditional in the sense that she's got this kind of old school mentality about how women are meant to behave, how people of different social classes and social structures are meant to behave. And she's very, very religious and pious and tied to her own position and her own self righteousness. Whereas Vera is this kind of modern woman. She is working outside of the home. She is not wealthy like um, Emily Brent used to be. And she is, um, we know in some regards that she's had this romantic relationship with Hugo, and I don't think it's a long shot to think that it may or may not have gotten physical in a way that Emily Brent would never allow herself to behave. However, despite their kind of differences in that they represent two different types of women, um, Vera being this very modern, new age kind of woman, I think it is important to note that both are unmarried and both have no children. And it's important, I think, to note that because both of them, despite their differences and despite their kind of different type of women that they are, neither of them really meet the social expectation of what a woman should do, because they are not married, they do not have children, and that would have been something back in at this particular time, specifically, that they would have been expected to do. So neither of them, despite whatever side of the coin they represent, neither of them really meet that social expectation of what a woman should be. And we know, based on kind of Vera's view of Cyril and how Emily treats Beatrice Taylor, that neither one is particularly maternal either. So take that for what you will. During their kind of tete-a-tete, their clandestine meeting with each other, we get to learn more about Miss Brent and her backstory. There's more to her than this armor of virtue. And if you remember back to the indictment, she's been accused of being responsible for the death of Beatrice Taylor. And we come to find out that Emily is taking Vera into her confidence because she is a woman. She says, "Look, I didn't say anything last night because it about Beatrice Taylor because it wasn't a conversation that I could have in mixed company." And in those days, we can assume that it this kind of desire to be sensitive, or this desire to not talk about it among men, is that it in some ways it revolves around sex. This kind of sad story of Beatrice Taylor, which is why it's not meant to be. I mean, it wouldn't be proper to talk about that in front of men. So we find out that Beatrice Taylor is her servant. She comes from a good family. She has nice manners. She's clean, and she is a good kind of person to have as a servant. But despite all of those kind of appearances type things, Beatrice, according to Emily, is not a nice girl. And nice does not mean like, oh, she's friendly or whatever. I would assume that she's a very nice girl. But to Emily, she's not nice because she has loose morals. And she finds herself because of her loose morals, she is in trouble. And that, of course, means pregnant out of wedlock. And Emily, in her self-righteous piety, fires Beatrice, kicks her out, and leaves this young, pregnant girl abandoned, broke, and desperate. And is it any wonder that Beatrice Taylor takes her own life? No. I mean, Emily has left her in no other. I mean, what alternative has she had? And the question I have for you is Emily responsible for Beatrice Taylor's suicide? And I mean, she doesn't think so. Vera thinks so. Vera thinks that she's very much responsible. But she's so steadfast in her blamelessness. And on the opposite end, Vera sees her as this as terrible. And her view of Emily has changed from being, this somewhat ridiculous religious old woman to this kind of monster. And I want to know what you guys think. And let's not forget the irony here. Prior to telling the story of Beatrice Taylor, we see what Emily thinks of everyone else. She is convinced that Rogers is guilty of whatever the indictment said that he was guilty of. She knows that, but she knows that no one of high social standing, like the doctor or the judge or the general even, could be responsible for what they have been accused of because because of their high social standing and their good appearance. So we automatically get this prejudice that Emily has of people of her own higher class versus those of someone like Beatrice Taylor or the Rogerses. And we also know how she feels about Philip Lombard. She thinks that he is awful because he's left 20 some odd men to die. And Vera says, well, they're just natives. No big deal. They're just natives. And the response from Emily is kind of rich. It's kind of almost laughable in some ways. She says that those natives, black or white, purple or green, whatever you want to say, those natives are essentially God's creatures. They are our brethren. They are our brothers. And again, I hope that the irony is not lost on you guys here, is that what about Beatrice Taylor then? Beatrice Taylor, someone she knows, someone that she has that's personally connected to her, that she's personally vested in, isn't she our sister? Isn't she someone that we should care about? But no, she's left out in the cold with no other option, and she's, done away with herself. But Emily, it's like that's beyond her. She's excused for her behavior and treatment of Beatrice, whereas as someone who is, I don't know, not a native, but Armstrong is, not Armstrong, Lombard is this terrible person. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pick up with the rest of our chapter selection.